The house stood at the end of a gravel road, where the city's noise thinned into something closer to silence. It was the kind of place that didn't invite curiosity. 3 stories of gray stone, windows that caught the afternoon light without warmth, a gate that opened only when expected. The neighborhood knew what it was. They didn't discuss it. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of cigarette smoke and brewed tea. The floors were dark wood, polished but not pristine. The house stood at the end of a gravel road, where the city's noise thinned into something closer to silence. It was the kind of place that didn't invite curiosity. 3 stories of gray stone, windows that caught the afternoon light without warmth, a gate that opened only when expected. The neighborhood knew what it was. They didn't discuss it. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of cigarette smoke and brewed tea. The floors were dark wood, polished but not pristine. The furniture was expensive in a way that suggested function over display. Everything had a place. Everything stayed in its place, except the people. Kim Jae-sung had lived in this house for 32 years. He inherited it the way some men inherit debt. It came with expectations, with history, with a name that opened doors and closed others. He was 41 now. His hair was still black, cut short and neat. His suits were tailored in a shop on the east side, where the owner never asked questions and never kept records. He wore dark glasses indoors and out, the kind that hid more than light sensitivity. He had been blind since he was 19. The men who worked for him knew this, of course. They had known it for years. But knowledge and understanding are not the same thing, and the gap between them had been widening for some time now. Jae-sung could hear it in the way they spoke when they thought he wasn't listening. The pauses that lasted a moment too long. The shuffling of feet that suggested hesitation. The laughter that came too quickly after he left a room. He had built his authority on precision, on knowing things before they were said, on arriving at conclusions while others were still asking questions. But precision requires information, and information requires eyes. For years he had compensated. He memorized voices, cataloged footsteps, tracked changes in temperature and air current that told him when a door opened or when someone entered a room. He developed instincts that looked like omniscience. But instincts have limits, and his men had begun to notice. The first sign came on a Tuesday in March. Jae-sung had called a meeting to discuss a shipment that was 3 days overdue. 7 men sat around the table in the downstairs room with the heavy curtains. He could hear the scrape of chairs, the click of a lighter, someone clearing their throat. He stood at the head of the table, hands resting on the back of his chair. "Park Min-ho," he said. "The shipment." There was a pause. Then Min-ho's voice, coming from the wrong direction. He had moved seats. "That's not an answer. The supplier says there was a delay at the border. Weather." Jae-sung tilted his head slightly. There was no weather. Another pause. Longer this time. He heard fabric rustle, someone shifting weight. Then Min-ho again, but with something new in his tone. Something that might have been amusement. "Then I guess he's lying to us." The room went quiet. Not the respectful quiet that usually followed Jae-sung's statements, but something else, something watchful. He could feel the attention in the room redistributing itself, no longer centered on him but spreading out, taking in the possibility that he didn't know as much as he claimed. He handled it the way he had always handled uncertainty. He gave an instruction that was precise enough to suggest complete knowledge. "Find out where the shipment actually is. I want a location by tonight. If the supplier is lying, I want to know what he's hiding and why. If he's telling the truth, I want to know who convinced him to change the route. Either way, someone made a decision without clearing it with me first." Min-ho said yes. The meeting continued. But the tone had shifted. Jae-sung could hear it in the way they spoke to each other after he dismissed them. Voices that didn't drop quite as low as they once did when he passed in the hallway. The housekeeper arrived on a Thursday morning in April. Jae-sung didn't hire her himself. That was handled by Mrs. Cho, the woman who managed the household staff and had worked for Jae-sung's father before him. Mrs. Cho was 63 and treated the house like a temple. She chose people who understood discretion, people who could clean a room and forget what they had seen in it.
The new housekeeper's name was Yoon Mi-ra.
28 years old, unmarried, no family in Seoul. She had worked in hotels before this, the kind that catered to foreign businessmen and charged by the hour. She was hired to replace a woman who had quit without explanation, which happens sometimes in houses like this. Jae-sung met her the way he met everyone, by sound and proximity. She entered the study where he was sitting, and he heard Mrs. Cho make the introduction. Mi-ra's voice was quiet, with a slight accent that suggested she had grown up somewhere south. She said it was an honor to work here. She said she would do her best. He told her the house had rules. No questions about the men who came and went. No phone calls made from the house phone. No visitors. No discussing what happened here with anyone outside these walls. She said she understood. Mrs. Cho led her away to show her the cleaning schedule. For the first 2 weeks, Mi-ra was nearly invisible. She would hear her moving through the house in the early mornings, the soft brush of cloth against wood, water running in distant sinks. She cleaned in a pattern, starting on the 3rd floor and working down. She didn't linger in rooms where people were working. She didn't speak unless spoken to. But she watched. Jae-sung didn't know this yet, but Mi-ra had a particular skill. She noticed things, small things, the way men positioned themselves in a room, who sat closest to the door, who avoided eye contact with whom. She had learned this working in hotels, where reading a situation quickly could mean the difference between getting a tip and getting hurt. She carried it with her like a second language. In this house, she saw things that troubled her. Not the obvious things. She had expected the men who arrived at odd hours, the packages that were never opened in her presence, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She had expected all of that. What troubled her was subtler. She saw the way the men looked at Jae-sung when he couldn't see them looking, the glances exchanged, the small smirks, the body language that suggested they were sharing a joke at someone's expense. She saw Park Min-ho move a chair 6 inches to the left before a meeting, then watch as Jae-sung reached for it and found it out of place. She saw the way his hand paused, just for a moment, before adjusting. She saw Min-ho smile. She said nothing. It wasn't her place. She was there to clean and be forgotten. But she kept watching. The second incident happened in early May. One of the younger men, Lee Jin-woo, had been skimming money from the weekly collections. It wasn't a large amount, but it was regular, which suggested either stupidity or contempt. Jae-sung called him into the study on a Wednesday evening. Jin-woo stood in front of the desk, trying to control his breathing. "You've been taking money," Jae-sung said. Jin-woo denied it. His voice was steady, which meant he had prepared for this. "I wouldn't do that. Someone's trying to set me up." Jae-sung opened a drawer and placed something on the desk, a ledger. "The amounts don't match. Every week for 6 weeks, and numbers are here." Jin-woo looked at the ledger, then he looked at Jae-sung, and then he did something that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. He said, "That's not my handwriting." The problem was, it wasn't. The ledger was in Braille. Jae-sung had assumed Jin-woo wouldn't know that, wouldn't think to check, but Jin-woo had leaned close enough to see the raised dots on the page, and now he understood. The accusation was based on a document Jae-sung couldn't verify visually. It was a guess. An educated guess perhaps based on reports from others, but a guess nonetheless. Jin-woo's posture changed, not dramatically, just a slight straightening of the shoulders, a small adjustment in tone. "If someone told me I was stealing, they're lying. I don't know what that ledger says, but it's not proof of anything." Jae-sung sat very still. The silence stretched. Then he said, "Get out." Jin-woo left. He told the others what happened. Within days, everyone in the organization knew that Jae-sung had made an accusation he couldn't back up, that he had relied on something he couldn't personally verify. The story changed slightly with each retone, but the core remained the same. He had miscalculated. He had shown weakness. The following week, 2 shipments went missing. No explanations, no apologies, just gone. When Jae-sung demanded answers, the responses were vague. Complications, miscommunications, bad luck. The words of men who were no longer afraid of consequences. He began to understand that something fundamental had shifted. The organization he had built through careful control was developing cracks, not in the operations themselves, but in the belief system that held them together. His authority had rested on the assumption that he saw everything, knew everything. That assumption was eroding. He needed information, real information, the kind that didn't filter through other people's interpretations, but he had no way to get it. He couldn't watch the men himself. He couldn't verify documents. He couldn't read the expressions on faces that told him when someone was lying. He was dependent on reports from people who were increasingly invested in controlling what he knew. Mi-ra had been working in the house for 6 weeks when she found the photograph. It was tucked behind a bookshelf in the 2nd floor hallway, probably dropped and forgotten. The photo showed 3 men standing outside a warehouse. One of them was Park Min-ho. She recognized the other 2 from their visits to the house. They were smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. It was the kind of photo people take when they're celebrating something. She looked at the date stamp, last Tuesday. The day Min-ho had told Jae-sung he was in Busan handling a supplier dispute. Mi-ra held the photograph for a long time, then she put it in her pocket. That evening, she was cleaning the study when Jae-sung came in. He sat at his desk, rubbing his temples. She continued dusting, trying to be quiet, but then he spoke. "You've been here 6 weeks." She paused. "Yes, sir." "Mrs. Cho says you're competent?" "I try to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know what we do here?" It was the first direct question anyone had asked her about the nature of the household. She chose her words carefully. "I know it's not my business to know." "That's a diplomatic answer." She didn't respond. He seemed to be thinking about something. Then he said, "If you saw something that seemed wrong, would you mention it?" The question hung in the air. Mi-ra understood that this was a test, though she wasn't sure what kind. She said, "That would depend on whether mentioning it would help or make things worse." He almost smiled, also diplomatic. She finished dusting and left the room. But the next morning, when she brought tea to the study, she set the cup down and said, very quietly, "Park Min-ho was not in Busan last Tuesday. He was at a warehouse on the east side with 2 other men. They looked pleased about something." Jae-sung went still. "How do you know this?" "I saw a photograph. It was dated." "Where is it now?" She took it from her pocket and placed it on the desk. "Here." He reached for it, fingers tracing the edges. Then he set it down. "Describe it to me." She did. The warehouse, the men, their expressions, the way they stood close together like conspirators or friends. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "Thank you." She left the study. Behind her, Jae-sung sat with the photograph he couldn't see, holding evidence of a lie he had suspected but couldn't prove. For the first time in months, he had information that didn't come filtered through his own organization. Information from someone who had no reason to lie to him, because she had nothing to gain from the lie. It was a small thing, one photograph, one contradiction, but it was the beginning of something else. Over the next 3 weeks, Mi-ra began to tell him things. Not constantly, not as a formal report, just small observations, delivered quietly when they were alone. She told him that Min-ho had been meeting with Jung Song-ho, one of the mid-level operators, at least twice a week in the downstairs room when they thought the house was empty. She told him that someone had been going through the files in the 3rd-floor office, because the papers were always slightly out of order when she came to clean. She told him that 2 of the younger men had started carrying themselves differently, with more confidence, like they had received assurances from someone. She never offered interpretations. She just described what she saw. Jae-sung began to understand that he had stumbled onto something valuable. Not loyalty, exactly. Mi-ra wasn't loyal to him. She barely knew him. But she had a clarity of observation that came from being invisible, from watching without being watched. She saw the house the way he used to, when he could still see, completely, honestly. He started asking her specific questions. What time did Mi-ra arrive yesterday? Who was he with? How long did they stay? Did they seem anxious or relaxed? She answered everything with the same calm precision. She never embellished. She never guessed. If she didn't know something, she said so. Slowly, carefully, Jae-sung began to rebuild his understanding of what was happening in his own house, and what he discovered was worse than he had imagined. Park Min-ho had been with the organization for 9 years. He had risen through competence and patience, managing operations that required both intelligence and discretion. Jae-sung had trusted him more than most. That trust had been a mistake. Using Mi-ra's observations and his own careful questioning, Jae-sung pieced together the shape of the conspiracy. Mi-ra was building a parallel power structure, recruiting men who were frustrated with the current leadership, not through open rebellion, but through quiet suggestion, through planting doubts, through demonstrating again and again that Jae-sung's grip on the organization was weakening, that he couldn't see what was happening under his own roof. The irony wasn't lost on Jae-sung. They were using his blindness against him in the most literal way possible. They were operating in plain sight, counting on the fact that plain sight meant nothing to him. They were right to do so. Without Mi-ra, he would never have known. The question was what to do about it. Traditional responses wouldn't work here. He couldn't simply remove Mi-ra. The man had cultivated too many relationships, created too many dependencies. If Jae-sung moved against him directly, it would force a confrontation that he wasn't certain he could win. Half the organization might side with Mi-ra, and then it would become a question of numbers and violence, neither of which favored Jae-sung in his current position. He needed to be more careful, more precise. He needed to undermine Mi-ra's position the same way Mi-ra had undermined his, through doubt, through demonstration, through showing the organization that their assumption about his weakness was premature. But But to do that, he needed information. Constant, reliable, detailed information about everything happening in the house and beyond. He needed eyes. He called Mira into the study one evening in late May. She stood in front of the desk, waiting. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." "Yes, sir." "What you've been telling me, the things you notice, it's been helpful, very helpful. But I need more than occasional observations. I need you to pay attention deliberately, to watch specific people, to tell me not just what you see, but patterns of behavior, changes, things that don't fit." He paused. "I'm asking you to become involved in something that isn't housekeeping, and it might be dangerous." Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you asking me to spy on your own men?" "Yes." "Why me?"
"Because you're invisible to them. Because you notice things without being noticed. And because I think you're smart enough to understand what's at stake here." She considered this. What's at stake? Control of this organization, my authority, possibly my life if things go badly enough. And if I say no, then you continue as the housekeeper, and we never have this conversation again. She thought about it. It would have been easy to refuse. Safer, certainly. She was being offered a chance to stay invisible, to do her job and collect her salary, and avoid the complications of a world she didn't belong to. Most people would have taken it. But Mira had grown up poor in a small town where opportunities were scarce and mostly reserved for other people. She had learned early that safety was often just another word for stagnation, that the careful path kept you alive, but rarely got you anywhere better. She had come to Seoul with nothing, worked in hotels that treated her like furniture, saved money slowly while watching other people live larger lives. She had become very good at being invisible, but she had never liked it. This was something different. This was someone asking her to use invisibility as power rather than accept it as a limitation. It was dangerous, but it was also the first time anyone had suggested she might be capable of something more than cleaning floors. She said, "What do you need me to do?" Over the next month, Mira became Jae-sung's eyes in a way that went far beyond simple observation. She developed a system. Every morning, she would brief him on who had come and gone the previous day. Not just names, but demeanor. Who seemed nervous? Who seemed confident? Who was lying about where Lee had been? In the evenings, she would tell him about conversations she had overheard, careful to distinguish between what was actually said and what she interpreted it to mean. She started positioning herself in ways that let her see more. She learned which rooms had the best acoustics for overhearing conversations. She found reasons to clean near doorways during important meetings. She memorized schedules so she knew when people were where they claimed to be and when they weren't. Jae-sung, in turn, began to act on this information with a precision that surprised his men. He would reference conversations he shouldn't have known about. He would correct people on details they hadn't shared with him. He would ask questions that revealed he knew exactly where they had been and what they had been doing, even when they had lied about it. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. The men began to wonder if they had underestimated him, if perhaps his blindness wasn't the weakness they had thought, if somehow he was still seeing things they assumed were hidden. The mocking stopped. The small acts of disrespect became less frequent. When Jae-sung entered a room, the conversation stopped the way it used to. Park Min-ho noticed. He was smart enough to recognize that something had changed, that information was flowing in ways it hadn't before. He started being more careful about where he had his private conversations. He stopped meeting with Jung Sung-ho in the house. He became suspicious of the phone lines, of the rooms he used, of who might be listening. But he didn't suspect Mira. No one did. She was still just the housekeeper, still invisible. She cleaned the rooms where they plotted against Jae-sung, dusted the tables where they spread their papers, brought them tea while they discussed their plans. They talked around her like she was furniture, and she remembered everything. In June, 2 things happened that shifted the balance further. The first was that one of Min-ho's key allies, a man named Choi Dae-jung, was arrested for assault after a fight outside a bar. It was bad luck, the kind of random event that occasionally disrupts careful planning. Dae-jung was looking at serious time unless someone intervened. Min-ho wanted to use organizational resources to help him, to demonstrate that he took care of his people. Jae-sung refused. He made the decision in a meeting with all the senior men present. He said the organization couldn't afford to draw attention right now, that Dae-jung had acted recklessly and would have to handle the consequences himself. It was a harsh call, but it was also strategically sound. Min-ho couldn't argue against the logic without seeming to prioritize loyalty over operational security. Dae-jung went to prison. Min-ho's people saw that their leader couldn't protect them when it mattered. Some of them began to reconsider their allegiances. The second thing was smaller but more personal. Mira told Jae-sung that Min-ho had been going through his desk. She had noticed the papers were rearranged, the drawers opened and not quite closed correctly. Min-ho was looking for something, probably documents that would give him leverage or reveal Jae-sung's plans. Jae-sung thought about this for a few days. Then he did something calculated. He left a document in his desk drawer, positioned where Min-ho would find it easily.
The document outlined a plan to restructure the organization's leadership, removing Minho from his position and redistributing his responsibilities. It was detailed enough to seem legitimate. It was also completely fabricated. Minho found it exactly as predicted. Mi-ra, watching from the hallway, saw him read it and then carefully return it to where he found it. His expression was tight, angry, worried. What Minho didn't know was that the document was bait. Jae-sung had crafted it specifically to force a reaction, and Minho, believing he had discovered a genuine plan, began to act with new urgency. He accelerated his timeline. He started reaching out to more people, trying to build a coalition quickly before Jae-sung could move against him. This was exactly what Jae-sung wanted. Minho, moving too fast, made mistakes. He approached men who weren't as sympathetic as he thought. He made promises he couldn't keep. He revealed more about his plans than he intended, trying to convince people to join him before it was too late. And Mi-ra, watching all of this, reported each misstep back to Jae-sung. By mid-July, Jae-sung had a complete picture of Minho's conspiracy. He knew who was involved, he knew what they wanted, he knew how they planned to achieve it, and most importantly, he knew they were operating from a false understanding of his intentions, rushing to counter a threat that didn't actually exist. It was time to act, but not with violence, not with the kind of dramatic confrontation that would split the organization. Jae-sung had learned something important over these months. Power wasn't about force, it was about perception, about making people believe things that served your interests. Minho had used that against him, and now he would use it back.
He called a meeting. Everyone senior in the organization was required to attend. They gathered in the large room on the first floor, the one with the long table and the windows that faced the garden. Jae-sung stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the back of his chair, waiting until everyone was settled. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, almost conversational. He said he wanted to talk about the future of the organization, about changes that needed to be made, about restructuring roles to better reflect people's capabilities and contributions. He listed several positions that would be modified, new responsibilities, new authorities. He was specific and detailed. None of it matched the fake document he had left for Minho to find. The plan was entirely different, focused on expanding operations rather than consolidating power. It was actually a good plan, one that gave more autonomy to several people in the room, including some of Minho's allies. Then, almost as an aside, he mentioned that there had been some confusion recently. Some people had gotten the wrong impression about his intentions. He said he understood how that could happen, how rumors could spread in an organization like this. He said he wanted to clear things up. He wanted everyone to understand that he valued their contributions, that he recognized the organization's success depended on all of them working together. It was a masterful performance. He was offering an exit, a way for Minho's people to step back from the conspiracy without admitting they had been part of it. He was acting as if the whole thing had been a misunderstanding rather than a betrayal, and in doing so, he was demonstrating exactly the kind of strength that had been questioned. He was showing that he was in control enough to be generous, secure enough to offer forgiveness for offenses he wasn't even officially acknowledging. The room was silent. Then Jung Sang-ho, one of Minho's closest allies, spoke up. He said the new plan sounded good, practical. He said he appreciated the clarity. One by one, others voiced agreement. They were accepting the exit Jae-sung had offered, stepping away from Minho without having to admit what they were stepping away from. Minho sat at the table, his face carefully neutral. He understood what had just happened. Jae-sung had outmaneuvered him completely. The fake document had been a trap, designed to make him reveal himself while Jae-sung prepared a real plan that undercut the entire conspiracy. Minho's people were being offered a better deal with less risk, and they were taking it. His coalition was dissolving in real time. After the meeting, Minho approached Jae-sung in the hallway. They were alone except for Mi-ra, who was dusting a table nearby. Minho said, "That was well played." Jae-sung tilted his head slightly. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Minho's voice was bitter. "You knew, the whole time. You let me think I was building something and you were just watching." "I don't watch anything," Jae-sung said quietly. "I listen, I think. I pay attention to what people do rather than what they say. Someone's been talking to you, telling you things. People talk to me all the time. Not like this, someone close. Someone who sees things." Minho looked around the hallway. His gaze passed over Mi-ra without stopping. "I'll find out who." "You're welcome to try," Jae-sung said. "But maybe instead of looking for traitors, you should think about why people stopped believing in you. Why your coalition fell apart the moment they were offered something better." Minho didn't respond. He left the house that night and didn't come back. 3 days later, Jae-sung received word that Minho had left Seoul entirely, taken a position with a smaller organization in Incheon. It was a demotion in everything but title. Everyone in the business would know what it meant, that he had lost, that he had tried to take over and failed. The house was quieter after that. Not empty exactly. There were still meetings, still men coming and going at odd hours, but the atmosphere had changed. The subtle disrespect was gone. When Jae-sung spoke, people listened. When he gave instructions, they were followed. The organization had remembered why he was in charge. Mi-ra continued her work. She still cleaned the floors, still brought tea, still moved through the house like a shadow. But something had shifted for her too. The men looked at her differently now, though they didn't know why. There was a wariness that hadn't been there before. They couldn't identify what had changed, only that something had. They were more careful around her, more conscious of what they said.
She found this amusing in a distant sort of way. She had spent most of her life being invisible, and now she was invisible in a different manner, not ignored but actively unnoticed, which was a subtle but important distinction. They knew, on some level, that something in the house was watching them. They just didn't know it was her. One evening in August, she was cleaning the study when Jae-sung called her over. He said, "Sit down." She hesitated. "Sir, I should finish." "Sit." She sat in the chair across from his desk. He was quiet for a moment, his hands resting in front of him. Then he said, "What you did, helping me see what was happening, it changed things. You understand that?" "I understand." "You could have stayed invisible, stayed safe. Why didn't you?" It was a question she had asked herself many times. The answer wasn't simple. She said, "I suppose I got tired of watching things happen without being part of them." "You were part of them. You were keeping the house running." "That's different. That's just maintaining what already exists. What you asked me to do, it was creating something, changing something. I'd never done that before." He nodded slowly. "Did it feel good, having that kind of influence?" She thought about it. "It felt necessary. I'm not sure about good." "That's an honest answer." He paused. "I'm going to ask you something else, and again, I need you to think before you answer. I'd like you to continue doing what you've been doing. Not just the observing, but helping me understand what's happening. I need someone I can trust to tell me the truth about this organization. Someone who has no stake in the politics, no ambitions, but would compromise what they tell me." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking you to be more than the housekeeper, to be my advisor, my eyes. Officially."
Mi-ra looked at him. "The men won't like that. Some of them won't accept it. I know. They'll resent me, maybe worse than resent. Probably. And you think that's worth it? I think I need someone I can trust more than I need to worry about their feelings. But you're right that it comes with risks. For both of us, but mostly for you. If you say no, I'll understand." She was quiet for a long time. The smart thing would be to refuse, to take her salary, do her job, stay invisible and safe. The smart thing was almost always the careful thing. But Mi-ra had been careful her whole life, and it had gotten her exactly nowhere she wanted to be. She said, "I'll do it." He smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible, but it was there. "Thank you." That night, lying in her small room on the 3rd floor, Mi-ra thought about what she had agreed to. She understood that her life had just become more complicated, that she had accepted a role that would make her enemies among people who were used to getting what they wanted, that she was now entangled in a world she had spent months carefully observing from the outside. But she also understood that she had, for the first time in her life, chosen something that mattered, not just to her, but to someone else. She had value that went beyond her ability to clean a floor or bring tea without being asked. She had become necessary in a way that felt both dangerous and strangely validating. The next morning, Jae-sung told Mrs. Cho that Mi-ra's responsibilities were changing, that she would be spending more time assisting him directly and less time on general housekeeping. Mrs. Cho asked no questions. She had worked in this house long enough to know when things were better left unexamined. She reassigned Mi-ra's cleaning duties to another woman and said nothing more about it. The men noticed immediately. They saw Mi-ra sitting in on meetings, standing beside Jae-sung's desk, being consulted about schedules and arrangements. They saw him turn to her and ask questions, saw her respond with information that was detailed and specific. They began to understand that something had changed, that this woman they had ignored for months had somehow become important. The reactions varied. Some of the men were merely confused. Others were resentful. A few were openly hostile, in the careful way that people are hostile when they can't afford to be obvious about it. They made comments, small jabs, questions about why a housekeeper was suddenly involved in organizational decisions, suggestions that Jae-sung was being influenced by someone who didn't understand the business. Jae-sung ignored all of it. He had learned something important during the confrontation with Min-ho, that his authority didn't depend on conforming to expectations, that he could make unconventional choices and enforce them through simple insistence and demonstrated results. If Mi-ra's information was good, if her observations were accurate, then the source didn't matter, and her information was very good. She told him things that changed how he approached problems, that certain men worked better in pairs than alone, that someone who seemed confident in meetings was actually uncertain and will follow whoever gave the clearest direction, that a particular operator was having financial trouble and might be vulnerable to offers from competitors, small details that accumulated into a comprehensive understanding of the organization's internal dynamics. Jae-sung used this information to make better decisions. He reorganized teams based on actual compatibility rather than seniority. He addressed problems before they became crises. He anticipated conflicts and diffused them. The organization ran more smoothly than it had in years, and the men, whatever their personal feelings about Mi-ra, couldn't argue with the results.
By September, a new equilibrium had been established. Mi-ra was no longer invisible, but she had become something else, something harder to define. She wasn't exactly Jae-sung's assistant, wasn't exactly his advisor. She was both and neither. She existed in a space that the organization hadn't had before, and they adjusted around her because they had no choice. She learned to navigate this new role carefully. She never gave orders directly. She never claimed authority she didn't have. She simply observed and reported, letting Jae-sung make the decisions. But she also learned when to offer opinions, when to push back on bad ideas, when to suggest alternatives. She discovered that she had good instincts for this work, that the skills she had developed staying invisible in dangerous situations translated well to the more subtle dangers of organizational politics. There were still problems. One of the men, a younger operator named Han Jun-sik, made the mistake of cornering her in the hallway one afternoon. He stood too close, his voice low and threatening. He said things about women who got above themselves, about people who didn't know their place. He said she should be careful, that accidents happened in houses like this. Mi-ra looked at him steadily. Then she said very quietly, "I know what happened to the shipment you were supposed to collect last Thursday, the one you told Jae-sung was delayed. I know you sold it yourself and kept the money. I know exactly how much you took and where you're keeping it. If anything happens to me, the first thing I'll do is make sure he knows all of that." Han's face went pale. "You're bluffing. You can test that if you want." He stepped back. He never spoke to her that way again. Word of the confrontation spread, though the details became exaggerated in the telling. The story that circulated was that Mi-ra had some kind of comprehensive knowledge of everyone's secrets, that she was documenting everything for Jae-sung. This wasn't exactly true, but it was useful. The men became more careful around her, more conscious of maintaining appearances. The truth was simpler. Mi-ra had overheard Han on the phone making arrangements. She had pieced together what he was doing from fragments of conversation. She had been fairly certain but not completely certain when she confronted him. But she had delivered the accusation with enough confidence that he believed she knew everything. Sometimes perception was more important than fact. Jae-sung, when she told him what happened, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did he really steal that shipment?" "Yes." "You're sure?" "Yes." "How much?" She told him. He nodded slowly, then made a call. 2 days later, Han was gone. No confrontation, no explanation. He simply stopped coming to the house. Someone else took over his responsibilities. The message was clear. Mi-ra's word carried weight. Threatening her was the same as threatening Jae-sung. After that, the atmosphere changed again. The men stopped seeing her as an oddity or an intruder. She became part of the house's structure. Like Mrs. Cho or the heavy curtains or the dark wood floors. She was simply there, a fact of their working environment that they adapted to. Mi-ra found this strange. She had gone from invisible to visible to a different kind of invisible. But this version felt different from before. She wasn't being ignored. She was being accommodated. It was a subtle but meaningful distinction.
In October, something happened that changed things in a way no one had anticipated. Jae-sung's cousin arrived from Daegu. His name was Kim Tae-min, and he was 35. Loud, ambitious, in the way of people who have never had to work for anything. He had heard about Minho's departure and saw an opportunity. He wanted a position in the organization, something senior, something that reflected his family connection. Jae-sung had no interest in this. Tae-min was incompetent and lazy, the kind of person who traded on relationships rather than merit. But he was family, and family came with obligations. Jae-sung agreed to let him stay at the house for a few weeks, to see if there might be some role he could fill that wouldn't cause damage. Tae-min made himself immediately unpopular. He was rude to the staff, dismissive of the men who worked there, casual about the organization's rules. He treated the house like a hotel and the people in it like servants. He made demands. He complained. He drank too much and talked too freely. Mi-ra, watching him, saw something else. She saw that Tae-min was also careless. He left documents out. He talked on the phone about sensitive matters in rooms where anyone could overhear. He mentioned names and locations and plans, as if security meant nothing. He was a vulnerability in a way that went beyond mere incompetence. She told Jae-sung this. He listened, then sighed. "He's family. I understand. I can't just throw him out. I'm not suggesting you do. I'm suggesting you make sure he doesn't have access to anything important." Jae-sung nodded. "That's already the plan, but he's going to cause problems regardless." He was right. Tae-min, feeling entitled to a position he hadn't earned, began making noise about being excluded. He complained to the other men that Jae-sung was disrespecting him, that family should mean something, that he deserved better treatment. Most of the men ignored him, but a few listened, not because they agreed, but because they saw an opportunity to create division.
One evening, Mi-ra overheard Tae-min talking to Jung Song-ho in the downstairs room. They were discussing Jae-sung in terms that were crude and dismissive. Tae-min said things about his cousin's blindness, about how it made him weak, about how the organization should be run by someone who could actually see what was happening. Song-ho was encouraging this talk, feeding Tae-min's resentment, suggesting that other people felt the same way. Mi-ra recognized what was happening. Song-ho was trying to use Tae-min as a proxy, to create conflict that would destabilize Jae-sung's position without directly challenging him. It was a coward strategy, but it might work if Tae-min was stupid enough to push things too far. She reported this to Jae-sung. He listened without expression, then said, "Song-ho was one of Minho's people. I thought he had learned his lesson. Some people don't learn. No, they just get better at hiding what they're thinking." He was quiet for a moment. "I need to deal with this before it grows. But Tae-min is family. If I move against him directly, it will cause problems with other relatives, obligations and expectations. Then don't move against him directly. Move against the people encouraging him." Jae-sung considered this. "You have something in mind?" She did. Over the next few days, she made sure that Tae-min heard certain things. She mentioned within his hearing that Jung Song-ho had been talking about him, that Song-ho had said other people Tae-min was a fool who was easy to manipulate, that Song-ho was laughing about how simple it was to wind Tae-min up and point him at Jae-sung like a weapon. This was partly true. Song-ho had said some of those things, though not in exactly those words. Mi-ra was simply making sure Tae-min heard the version that would make him angry at the right person. It worked. Tae-min confronted Song-ho in the hallway. The argument was loud and ugly. Tae-min accused Song-ho of using him. Song-ho, caught off guard, said things he shouldn't have, things that revealed exactly how little respect he had for Tae-min, how he had been planning to use the situation for his own benefit. Jae-sung, hearing the commotion, came into the hallway. He listened for a moment, then said very calmly, "Jung Song-ho, leave." Song-ho started to protest. Jae-sung cut him off. "You've been trying to create problems in my house, using my cousin to do it. That ends now. Get out." Song-ho left. He didn't have a choice. The other men had heard the argument, heard what he had said. They wouldn't support him after that. He had revealed himself as someone who created chaos for personal gain, and organizations like this couldn't afford people like that. Tae-min, shaken by the confrontation, was subdued for the rest of his visit. He left 2 days later, returning to Daegu without the position he had wanted. Jae-sung had managed to address the problem without directly confronting his cousin, letting Tae-min's own anger at being manipulated do the work instead.
After he was gone, Jae-sung said to Mi-ra, "That was well done. It was necessary." "Yes, but it was also clever. You understood what would make Tae-min act and used it. That's not something everyone can do." She didn't respond. She was still learning how to accept compliments in this new role, how to navigate the strange space between employee and confidant. It was easier to stay quiet. November brought rain, the kind of steady, gray rain that soaked everything and made the city feel smaller. The house was quieter during these weeks, fewer visitors, more internal work. The men spent long hours in the downstairs rooms, reviewing accounts, planning for the winter months when certain operations slowed and others accelerated. Mi-ra had been in the house for 7 months now. She knew its rhythms the way some people know music. She could tell when something was off just by listening to the pattern of footsteps on the stairs, by noticing which doors were closed that should have been open. She had become so attuned to the environment that she sometimes knew about problems before anyone reported them. One afternoon, she was going through the third-floor office when she noticed that the window was slightly open. This was unusual. The windows in that room were supposed to stay locked. She looked closer and saw scratches on the frame. Someone had forced it open from outside, probably climbed up using the trellis that ran along the back of the house. She told Jae-sung immediately. He called in 2 men and had them search the room thoroughly. They found a listening device tucked behind the bookshelf. It was small, professional, the kind of equipment that cost real money. Someone was conducting surveillance. Jae-sung had the device removed, but left the window apparently undisturbed. Over the next week, Mi-ra watched to see who showed unusual interest in that room, who seemed to be waiting for information they shouldn't have. She narrowed it down to 2 possibilities, both men who worked in external operations and would have had the connections to acquire that kind of equipment. Jae-sung decided to feed them false information. He had conversations in that room about a shipment that didn't exist, a deal that was entirely fabricated. Then he waited to see if anyone acted on it. 3 days later, one of the 2 men, an operator named Lim Ki-taek, made inquiries about a warehouse that matched the fake shipment's supposed location. He had taken the bait. Lim was removed from the organization that night, quietly.
No dramatics. He simply stopped being part of things. His contacts were redistributed, his responsibilities reassigned. The message was subtle but clear. The organization was watching. Betrayals would be caught. The other men noticed. They understood that something had changed about Jae-sung's ability to identify problems, that he seemed to know things he shouldn't know, that operating against him had become significantly more dangerous than it used to be. Some of them suspected Mi-ra was involved, but they couldn't prove it. She was still just there, quiet and observant, never quite visible enough to confront. In December, Jae-sung received an offer from another organization. They wanted to merge operations, combine resources. It was presented as a partnership, but the terms made it clear that it was actually an acquisition. They believed Jae-sung was weak, that his organization was vulnerable, that now was the time to absorb it before someone else did. The offer came through an intermediary, a man named Baek Hyun-woo who had connections in multiple organizations. He came to the house on a cold afternoon, carrying documents and proposals. He sat across from Jae-sung in the study and laid out the terms. Better resources, larger markets, security through size. All the usual arguments for why smaller fish should let themselves be swallowed by bigger ones. Jae-sung listened without interruption. When Baek finished, he said, "Tell them no." Baek seemed surprised. "You should think about it. This is a generous offer." "I've thought about it. The answer is no." "They won't make this offer again." "Good." Baek stood up, gathering his papers. "You're making a mistake. You've had problems recently. Everyone knows it. This is a chance to stabilize before things get worse. My problems are resolved. Tell your people I appreciate their concern, but we're not interested in merging." After Baek left, Mi-ra said, "He'll tell them you're being stubborn. That might make them push harder." "Let them push. We're in a better position than they think." "Are we?" He smiled slightly. 6 months ago we weren't, but things have changed. We're stable now, organized. The men are working together instead of working around me. We don't need to be absorbed by someone else." She understood what he was saying, that the work they had done, the information she had provided, the problems they had solved together, had fundamentally strengthened the organization, that it was no longer the vulnerable entity it had appeared to be when Minho was undermining it from within. But she also understood that refusing the offer would have consequences, that the other organization wouldn't just accept the rejection, that they might try other approaches. She was right. Over the next 3 weeks, there were attempts at intimidation. Small things. A shipment intercepted. A meeting disrupted. A few men approached with offers to switch sides. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was meant to send a message that Jae-sung had made the wrong choice, that resistance would be expensive.
Jae-sung responded with patience. He rerouted shipments, he secured new contacts, he ensured that the men who had been approached understood that leaving would be considered betrayal. He didn't escalate, but he didn't back down. He simply absorbed the pressure and continued operating. By January, the other organization lost interest. They had expected easy capitulation and encountered something else instead, something that required more effort than they wanted to invest. They moved on to other opportunities, leaving Jae-sung alone. The house settled back into its routines. Winter deepened. The garden outside the windows turned gray and barren. Inside, the men continued their work with the steady rhythm of people who understood their roles and accepted their place in the structure. Mi-ra had been in the house for 10 months. She had seen it transform from a place where the leader was quietly mocked to one where his authority was unquestioned. She had been part of that transformation in ways that most people would never know. She was still the woman who brought tea, who cleaned the rooms, who moved through the hallways without attracting attention, but she was also something else now, something that didn't have a proper name. One evening, Jae-sung asked her to sit with him in the study. It was late. The house was quiet. He said, "Do you ever regret it? Accepting this role?" She thought about the question. "Sometimes. It's more complicated than I expected." "Complicated how?" "I have to think about things I never used to think about. Who trusts who? Who's lying? What people want that they're not saying. It's exhausting." "But you're good at it." "That doesn't mean I always like it." He nodded. "I understand. I never wanted this either. The organization, the responsibility. It was inherited. Something I had to take on because of circumstances rather than choice." "Do you regret it?" "No. But I think about what it costs. What I've given up to maintain it. And I wonder sometimes if it was worth it." "What do you think the answer is?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think it depends on whether you measure worth by what you've achieved or by what you've avoided. If I measure by achievement, the answer is probably no. The organization isn't building anything. It's just maintaining itself, creating wealth for people who don't need it,
causing problems that wouldn't exist otherwise. But if I measure by avoidance, by what would have happened if I hadn't taken control, then maybe yes. There would have been chaos, worse people in charge, more violence. I tell myself that what I've built is at least stable, controlled, less bad than the alternatives. Is that enough? I don't know. Is it enough for you, to be part of this? She considered the question honestly. I think I'm still figuring that out. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The house creaked softly, the sound of old wood settling. Mi-ra thought about her life before this place. The hotels, the invisibility, the careful navigation of spaces where she didn't belong. She had traded that for a different kind of careful navigation, in a different kind of space. She wasn't sure if it was better, only that it was different. And for now, that was enough. February came. The house was preparing for the New Year's operations. There were meetings about supply chains and territories and arrangements with other organizations. Mi-ra sat in on most of them now, taking notes, offering observations when asked. The men had stopped questioning her presence. She was part of the furniture in a new way, essential, rather than decorative. One afternoon, she was reviewing some documents when she noticed something unusual. A payment that didn't match any operation she knew about. It was small enough to be overlooked, but regular enough to suggest it wasn't a mistake. She brought it to Jae-sung's attention. He had her describe the pattern. Then he made some calls. Within hours, he had determined that someone in accounting was siphoning money. Not large amounts, just enough to matter if it continued. The person was removed that evening. The money was recovered. But what struck Mi-ra was how routine it had become. This process of noticing, reporting, resolving. How the extraordinary had become ordinary. How she had adapted to a world where theft and betrayal were regular occurrences that required management rather than moral outrage. She mentioned this to Jae-sung later. He listened, then said, "You're becoming desensitized. That's normal in this work. Is it good? It's necessary. If you had a moral crisis every time someone did something wrong, you wouldn't be able to function here. You'd burn out in weeks. So I just accept it? Stop caring? You don't stop caring. You just care differently. You care about maintaining order, about preventing chaos, about keeping things stable. The individual betrayals matter less than the system's overall function." She understood what he was saying, but she also understood what it meant, that she was changing in ways that might not be reversible, that working in this environment was reshaping how she thought about right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, what was acceptable and what wasn't. She was becoming someone different from who she had been 10 months ago. That night, lying in her room, she thought about leaving, about walking away from this house and this role and returning to something simpler. She could find work somewhere else. Hotels always needed staff. She could go back to being invisible in the old way, where invisibility meant safety rather than power.
But she knew she wouldn't do it, not because she was trapped, but because she had discovered something about herself that she couldn't undiscover, that she liked being necessary, that she liked having influence, that she liked the feeling of knowing things other people didn't know, of understanding systems that were hidden from ordinary view. It was seductive in a way she hadn't anticipated, and walking away from it felt like admitting defeat. So she stayed, and the months continued. March brought new challenges, April brought new arrangements. May brought tensions with a competitor that required careful navigation. Through all of it, Mi-ra was there, watching, reporting, helping Jae-sung understand what was happening in the parts of the organization he couldn't see himself. The men had stopped thinking of her as unusual. She was simply part of how things worked now. When they wanted to communicate something to Jae-sung, they sometimes went through her. When they had questions about schedules or arrangements, they asked her. She had become a conduit, a translator between different parts of the organization that didn't always communicate well with each other. In June, something happened that reminded everyone why this work was dangerous. One of the operators, a man named Oh Dong-hyun, was killed in a confrontation with a rival organization. The details were unclear, but the result was definitive. He was simply gone, and someone had to take over his responsibilities. The funeral was small. Most of the men attended. Jae-sung stood in the back, listening to the service without seeing the casket, the flowers, the widow crying softly in the front row. Mi-ra stood beside him, describing what she saw in quiet tones. The people who came, the way they acted, who seemed genuinely sad and who was there out of obligation. After the service, in the car driving back to the house, Jae-sung was quiet. Finally he said, "Oh had been with us for 6 years. He was good at his job, careful, and it didn't matter.
One wrong moment, and he's dead. Mi-ra didn't respond. There wasn't much to say. This work has a cost, Jae-sung continued. We don't think about it most of the time. We focus on operations, on profits, on maintaining control. But the cost is there, in the people who get hurt, the families who lose someone, the lives that get smaller because of what we do. Are you questioning whether it's worth it? I'm acknowledging that it might not be, that we might be sustaining something that shouldn't be sustained, but also understanding that if we stopped, someone else would take our place, someone probably worse. So we continue, and we tell ourselves it matters that we're better than the alternatives, even if the alternatives are all bad. They didn't speak again until they reached the house. Mi-ra helped him inside, then went to her room. She thought about Oh Dong-hyun, whom she had barely known, about his widow, who would have to build a new life without him, about the costs that Jae-sung had mentioned, the ones that accumulated quietly while everyone focused on other things. She understood that this was part of the work too, not just the strategy and the information and the careful management of relationships, but the acknowledgement that what they were doing had real consequences for real people, that someone's absence meant someone else's grief, and that continuing anyway required a particular kind of moral compromise that got easier with practice, but never entirely comfortable. Summer arrived. The house was hot despite the air conditioning. The garden outside showed patches of green among the gray. Life continuing despite everything, indifferent to the human dramas playing out nearby. One afternoon in July, Mi-ra was in the third-floor office when she found something unexpected. A letter, tucked into a book that no one had opened in months. The letter was addressed to Jae-sung from his father, written years ago, before the old man died. She almost put it back without reading it, but something made her pause. The letter was short. It talked about responsibility and legacy, about how the organization was more important than any individual, how Jae-sung would face challenges, would have to make difficult choices, would sometimes wonder if it was worth it, and how the answer was that it had to be worth it, because the alternative was worse, that someone had to maintain order in spaces where order was fragile, that this was the burden of their family, and Jae-sung had to accept it even if he didn't want it. Mi-ra read it twice. Then she brought it to Jae-sung. She described what it said. He listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "I wondered where that had gone." "Did you know what it said?" "I had it read to me once, years ago. I'd forgotten most of it." He was quiet for a moment. "My father believed what he wrote, that we were providing a service, that the world needed people willing to do difficult things. I'm not sure I ever agreed with him, but I understood why he thought it." "Do you think he was right?" "I think he was rationalizing. We all do that. We tell ourselves stories about why what we're doing is necessary, important, even noble, because it's easier than admitting we're just perpetuating something that causes harm because we don't know how to stop." "But you haven't stopped." "No, because he was right about one thing. Someone has to maintain order in these spaces, and if it's not me, it will be someone else, probably someone worse. So I continue, and I try to be better than the alternatives, and I hope that counts for something." Mi-ra understood then that Jae-sung carried doubts that ran deeper than she had realized, that his confidence, his authority, his careful control, all of it was built on a foundation of uncertainty about whether any of it mattered. He continued because stopping felt like abandoning a responsibility, even if the responsibility itself was questionable. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the book. Some things were better left where they were found. August passed. September came. The house had been her home for over a year now. She knew every room, every sound, every pattern of behavior. She knew which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck. She knew how the light moved through the hallways as the sun shifted. She knew the men by their footsteps, could identify who was approaching before they entered a room. This knowledge had become automatic, like breathing. She didn't think about it anymore. She just knew. And that knowledge had made her indispensable in ways that went beyond her original role. She wasn't just Jae-sung's eyes. She was the house's memory, the organization's conscience in some strange way, the person who remembered everything and forgot nothing. One evening in late September, Jae-sung called her into the study. He seemed tired. He said, "I've been thinking about the future."
What about it? About what happens when I'm not running this anymore, whether through choice or circumstances. I need to make arrangements, ensure continuity. You're not planning to leave, are you? No, but I'm also not naive enough to think I'll be doing this forever. Things change, people get older, situations shift. I need to prepare for that. What does that have to do with me? He smiled slightly. Everything. You know more about how this organization actually works than anyone else. You've seen all the pieces. You understand the relationships, the weaknesses, the pressure points. If something happened to me, you are one of the few people who could help whoever takes over.
who could provide the kind of information they'd need to maintain stability. You want me to work for your successor. I want you to have the option, and I want whoever comes after me to understand that you're valuable, that they should listen to you. Mi-ra thought about this, about the idea of doing this work for someone else, someone who might not have Jae-sung's restraint, his careful consideration of consequences, someone who might use the information she provided in ways she didn't agree with. I'm not sure I want that. You might not have a choice. If I'm gone and the organization continues, they'll want you involved. You know too much to be left alone. It was a sobering thought, that her knowledge had made her valuable but also trapped, that she couldn't easily walk away from this world anymore, even if she wanted to. She had become too entangled, too necessary. That's a depressing way to think about the future. It's realistic. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're part of, that this isn't something you can just stop being involved in when you get tired of it. Once you're in, you're in. The only way out is if they decide you're not useful anymore, and that usually doesn't end well. She nodded slowly. She had known this, on some level, but hearing it stated plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. She had made choices over the past year that had consequences extending beyond anything she had imagined, and now she had to live with them. They sat in silence for a while. Then Jae-sung said, "I'm sorry, this isn't what you signed up for." I knew what I was getting into. Did you? Really? She thought about it honestly. No, not completely, but I chose it anyway, and I keep choosing it, so I can't blame you for the consequences. October brought rain again, the cycle repeating, the house settling into its seasonal rhythms. Mi-ra watched the garden from her window, seeing the leaves change color, fall, disappear under the gray sky. She thought about time passing, about how quickly a year could go by when you were focused on daily necessities rather than larger questions. She had changed in that year, become harder in some ways, more aware in others. She understood things about power and loyalty and human nature that she wished she didn't know. She had seen people betray each other for small gains, watched trust dissolve over minor slights, observed how quickly confidence could turn to doubt when circumstances shifted. But she had also learned things about herself, that she was capable of navigating complicated situations with skill, that she could read people accurately and anticipate their actions, that she had a talent for this kind of work, even if the work itself was morally ambiguous. These discoveries were both validating and troubling. It was good to learn you had abilities. It was less good to learn those abilities were best suited for a world you weren't entirely comfortable being part of. In November, Jae-sung's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just small things. Fatigue, headaches, difficulty sleeping. He dismissed it as stress, as the accumulated weight of running the organization. But Mi-ra noticed that he was slowing down, that his responses weren't as quick, that he sometimes seemed distracted in ways he hadn't before. She suggested he see a doctor. He refused. She suggested it again. He refused again. Finally, she simply made an appointment and told him he was going. To her surprise, he agreed. The doctor found nothing immediately concerning. Some elevated blood pressure, signs of chronic stress, recommendations to rest more, delegate more, reduce the workload, advice that was sensible and completely impractical given what Jae-sung did for a living. But the visit seemed to affect him. He came back to the house quieter than usual. That evening, he said to Mi-ra, "The doctor asked what I do for work. I told him I run a business. He asked what kind. I said import-export. He nodded like that explained everything, like he knew exactly what I meant and was choosing not to dig deeper."
Most people don't want to dig deeper. No, they prefer comfortable ignorance. And maybe that's wise. Maybe knowing too much makes life harder. Is that how you feel? Sometimes. I know too much about too many things, about people's weaknesses, their betrayals, their compromises. It makes it hard to trust anyone, hard to believe that relationships are genuine rather than strategic. You develop a kind of cynicism that's useful for this work, but corrosive for everything else. Mi-ra understood what he was describing. She felt it herself sometimes. The way this work changed how you looked at people, made you question motives, assume self-interest rather than generosity. It was protective, but also isolating. Do you have anyone you trust completely? He thought about it. Mrs. Cho, maybe. She's been here forever and has nothing to gain from betraying me. And you, I suppose, though I'm still not entirely sure why you stay. I'm not sure either sometimes. He smiled at that. Honest, at least. That's something. December arrived, the year drawing to a close. The house prepared for the holidays, though they were subdued here. No decorations, no celebrations. just acknowledgement that time was passing and would continue to pass regardless of what anyone did about it. Mi-ra had been in the house for 14 months. She thought about where she had been before this, the person she had been. That version of herself felt distant now, like someone she used to know but had lost touch with. She had wanted more from life than invisibility and careful navigation of other people's spaces. She had gotten it. Whether what she had gotten was better remained an open question. One afternoon, she found Jae-sung sitting in the study, listening to something on the radio, classical music, slow and melancholic. He said, without looking up, "Do you ever think about leaving? Starting over somewhere else?" "Sometimes. Do you?" "Less than I used to. I think I've accepted that this is what I am now, what I'll be until I can't do it anymore. There's a kind of peace in that acceptance. Depressing, maybe, but peaceful. Is that enough for you?" "It has to be." They sat together in the quiet room, listening to music that spoke of endings and continuations, of things that concluded and things that went on regardless. Outside, the city moved through its evening routines, people going home to families, to dinners, to lives that had nothing to do with the careful management of violence and control that happened in houses like this one. Mi-ra thought about those lives sometimes, about what it would be like to have something simpler. But she also knew that simple didn't mean better, that every life had its complications, its compromises, its moments of doubt about whether you were doing the right thing. She had just chosen complications that were more visible, more tangible than most. The music ended. Jae-sung turned off the radio. The silence that followed felt complete. He said, "Thank you for staying, for helping me see what I needed to see. I know it's cost you things you didn't expect to pay. It's cost you things, too." "Yes, but I had less choice in the matter. You could have walked away at any point. You didn't. That means something." Mi-ra stood up to leave. At the door, she paused. "Do you think we've made things better? The organization, the stability, all of it?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think we've made things less bad than they could have been. Whether that's the same as making them better, I don't know. But it's what we have." She nodded and left the room. Outside, the hallway was dark, except for a single light at the far end. She walked toward it slowly, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. Behind her, Jae-sung sat alone in the study, surrounded by a world he couldn't see but understood completely. In front of her, the rest of the house waited, full of men and secrets, and the quiet maintenance of order in places where order was always fragile. The house stood at the end of the gravel road, unchanged from the outside, continuing its work in the way that such places always do. And inside, two people who had found each other through necessity rather than choice, continued the complicated task of seeing and being seen, of maintaining control in a world designed to resist it, of making small differences in a system that mostly resisted difference. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't even particularly noble. But it was what they had, and they had chosen to make it mean something, even if that meaning remained ambiguous and uncertain, and subject to revision in the quiet hours when doubt crept in and stayed until morning came again.